Vietnam. Officially, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam is a country at the eastern edge of mainland Southeast Asia, with an area of about 331,000 square kilometers and a population of over 100 million, making it the world's 15th most populous country. One of the two Marxist-Leninist states in Southeast Asia, Vietnam shares land borders with China to the north, and Laos and Cambodia to the west. It shares maritime borders with Thailand through the Gulf of Thailand, and the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia through the South China Sea. Its capital is Hanoi and its largest city is Ho Chi Minh City, commonly known as Saigon. Vietnam was inhabited by the Paleolithic Age, with states established in the first millennium BC on the Red River Delta in modern-day northern Vietnam. The Han dynasty annexed northern and central Vietnam under Chinese rule from 111 BC, until the first dynasty emerged in 939. Successive monarchical dynasties absorbed Chinese influences through Confucianism and Buddhism, and expanded southward to the Mekong Delta, conquering Kampa. During most of the 17th and 18th centuries, Vietnam was effectively divided into two domains of Dang Trong and Dang Nguyen. Then when the last imperial dynasty surrendered to France in 1883. In 1887, its territory was integrated into French Indochina as three separate regions. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the nationalist coalition Viet Minh, led by the communist revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, launched the August Revolution and declared Vietnam's independence from the Empire of Japan in 1945. Vietnam went through prolonged warfare in the 20th century. After World War II, France returned to reclaim colonial power in the First Indochina War, from which Vietnam emerged victorious in 1954. As a result of the treaties signed between the Viet Minh and France, Vietnam was also separated into two parts. The Vietnam War began shortly after, between the Communist North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the anti-communist South Vietnam, supported by the United States. Upon the North Vietnamese victory in 1975, Vietnam reunified as a unitary socialist state under the Communist Party of Vietnam in 1976. An ineffective planned economy, a trade embargo by the West, and wars with Cambodia and China crippled the country further. In 1986, the CPV initiated economic and political reforms similar to the Chinese economic reform, transforming the country to a socialist-oriented market economy. The reforms facilitated Vietnamese reintegration into the global economy and politics. Vietnam is a developing country with a lower middle-income economy. It has high levels of corruption, censorship, environmental issues, and a poor human rights record. The country ranks among the lowest in international measurements of civil liberties, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion and ethnic minorities. It is part of international and intergovernmental institutions including the ASEAN, the APEC, the CPTPP, the Non-Aligned Movement, the OIF, and the WTO. It has assumed a seat on the United Nations Security Council twice. History. Archaeological excavations have revealed the existence of humans in what is now Vietnam as early as the Paleolithic Age. Stone artifacts excavated in Gia Lai province have been claimed to date to 780,000 years ago, based on associated find of tektites. However, this claim has been challenged because tektites are often found in archaeological sites of various ages in Vietnam. Homo erectus fossils dating to around 500,000 BC have been found in caves in Lang Son and Nay An provinces in northern Vietnam. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils from mainland Southeast Asia are of Middle Pleistocene provenance, and include isolated tooth fragments from Tom Om and Hang Hum. Teeth attributed to Homo sapiens from the late Pleistocene have been found at Dong Can, and from the early Holocene at Mai De Dieu, Lang Gao, and Lang Kuom. Areas comprising what is now Vietnam participated in the Maritime Jade Road, as ascertained by archaeological research. By about 1000 BC, the development of wet rice cultivation in the Ma River and Red River floodplains led to the flourishing of Dong Sun culture, notable for its bronze casting used to make elaborate bronze Dong Sun drums. At this point, the early Vietnamese kingdoms of Van Lang and O Lac appeared, and the culture's influence spread to other parts of Southeast Asia, including maritime Southeast Asia, throughout the first millennium BC. Dynastic Vietnam. According to Vietnamese legends, Hong Bang dynasty of the Hung Kings, first established in 2879 BC, is considered the first state in the history of Vietnam. In 257 BC, the last Hung King was defeated by Tuc Phan. He consolidated the Lac Viet and O Viet tribes to form the O Lac, proclaiming himself Nguyen Vuong. In 179 BC, a Chinese general named Zhao Tuo defeated Nguyen Vuong and consolidated O Lac into Nanyue. However, Nanyue was itself incorporated into the empire of the Chinese Han dynasty in 111 BC after the Han-Nanyue War. For the next 1,000 years, what is now northern Vietnam remained mostly under Chinese rule. Early independence movements, such as those of the Chung sisters and Lady Trieu, were temporarily successful, though the region gained a longer period of independence as Van Chien under the anterior Li dynasty between AD 544 and 602. By the early 10th century, northern Vietnam had gained autonomy, but not sovereignty, under the Cuc family. In AD 938, the Vietnamese Lord Ngo Quyen defeated the forces of the Chinese Southern Han state at Bac Dang River and achieved full independence for Vietnam in 939 after a millennium of Chinese domination. By the 960s, the dynastic Dai Viet Kingdom was established. Vietnamese society enjoyed a golden era under the Li and Tran dynasties. During the rule of the Tran dynasty, Dai Viet repelled 3 Mongol invasions. Meanwhile, the Mahayana branch of Buddhism flourished and became the state religion. Following the 1406-7 Ming, Ho War, which overthrew the Ho dynasty, Vietnamese independence was interrupted briefly by the Chinese Ming dynasty, but was restored by Le Loi, the founder of the Le dynasty. The Vietnamese polity reached their zenith in the Le dynasty of the 15th century, especially during the reign of Emperor Le Ton Tong. Between the 11th and 18th centuries, the Vietnamese polity expanded southward in a gradual process known as Nam Tien, eventually conquering the kingdom of Kampa and part of the Khmer kingdom. From the 16th century onward, civil strife and frequent political infighting engulfed much of Dai Viet. First, the Chinese-supported Mac dynasty challenged the Le dynasty's power. After the Mac dynasty was defeated, the Le dynasty was nominally reinstalled. Actual power, however, was divided between the northern Trin lords and the southern Nguyen lords, who engaged in a civil war for more than 4 decades before a truce was called in the 1670s. Vietnam was divided into North and South from 1600 to 1777. During this period, the Nguyen expanded southern Vietnam into the Mekong Delta, annexing the Central Highlands and the Khmer lands in the Mekong Delta. The division of the country ended a century later when the Tay Son brothers helped Trin to end Nguyen. They also established new dynasty and ended Trin. However, their rule did not last long, and they were defeated by the remnants of the Nguyen lords, led by Nguyen An. Nguyen An unified Vietnam, and established the Nguyen dynasty, ruling under the name Gia Long. French Indochina. In the 1500s, the Portuguese explored the Vietnamese coast and reportedly erected a stele on the Cham Islands to mark their presence. By 1533, they began landing in the Vietnamese delta but were forced to leave because of local turmoil and fighting. They also had less interest in the territory than they did in China and Japan. After they had settled in Macau and Nagasaki to begin the profitable Macau-Japan trade route, the Portuguese began to involve themselves in trade with Hoi An. Portuguese traders and Jesuit missionaries under the Padroado system were active in both Vietnamese realms of Dang Trong and Dang Nguai in the 17th century. The Dutch also tried to establish contact with Quinnan in 1601 but failed to sustain a presence there after several violent encounters with the locals. The Dutch East India Company only managed to establish official relations with Tonkin in the spring of 1637 after leaving Dejima in Japan to establish trade for silk. Meanwhile, in 1613, the first English attempt to establish contact with Hoi An failed following a violent incident involving the East India Company. By 1672 the English did establish relations with Tonkin and were allowed to reside in Pho Hien. Between 1615 and 1753, French traders also engaged in trade in Vietnam. The first French missionaries arrived in 1658, under the Portuguese Padroado. From its foundation, the Paris Foreign Missions Society under Propaganda Fide actively sent missionaries to Vietnam, entering Cochin China first in 1664 and Tonkin first in 1666. Spanish Dominicans joined the Tonkin mission in 1676, and Franciscans were in Cochin China from 1719 to 1834. The Vietnamese authorities began to feel threatened by continuous Christianization activities. After several Catholic missionaries were detained, the French Navy intervened in 1843 to free them, as the kingdom was perceived as xenophobic. In a series of conquests from 1859 to 1885, France eroded Vietnam's sovereignty. At the Siege of Touraine in 1858, France was aided by Spain with Filipino, Latin American, and Spanish troops from the Philippines and perhaps some Tonkinese Catholics. After the 1862 treaty, and especially after France completely conquered Lower Cochin China in 1867, the Van Then movement of scholar gentry class arose and committed violence against Catholics across central and northern Vietnam. Between 1862 and 1867, the southern third of the country became the French colony of Cochin China. By 1884, the entire country was under French rule, with the central and northern parts of Vietnam separated into the two protectorates of Annam and Tonkin. The three entities were formally integrated into the Union of French Indochina in 1887. The French administration imposed significant political and cultural changes on Vietnamese society. A Western-style system of modern education introduced new humanist values. Most French settlers in Indochina were concentrated in Cochin China, particularly in Saigon, and in Hanoi, the colony's capital. During the colonial period, guerrillas of the Royalist Can Vuong movement rebelled against French rule and massacred around a third of Vietnam's Christian population. After a decade of resistance, they were defeated in the 1890s by the Catholics in reprisal for their earlier massacres. Another large-scale rebellion, the Thanh Nguyen Uprising, was also suppressed heavily. The French developed a plantation economy to promote export of tobacco, indigo, tea, and coffee. However, they largely ignored the increasing demands for civil rights and self-government. An increasing dissatisfaction even led to half-hearted, badly coordinated, and still worsely executed plots to oust the French, like the infamous Hanoi Poison Plot of 1908. A nationalist political movement soon emerged, with leaders like Phan Boi Chau, Phan Chau Trinh, Phan Dinh Phuong, Emperor Ham Nghi, and Ho Chi Minh fighting or calling for independence. This resulted in the 1930 Yen Bai mutiny by the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, which the French quashed. The mutiny split the independence movement, as many leading members converted to communism. The French maintained full control of their colonies until World War II, when the war in the Pacific led to the Japanese invasion of French Indochina in 1940. Afterwards, the Japanese Empire was allowed to station its troops in Vietnam while the pro-Vichy French colonial administration continued. Japan exploited Vietnam's natural resources to support its military campaigns, culminating in a full-scale takeover of the country in March 1945. This led to the Vietnamese famine of 1945, which killed up to 2 million people. First Indochina War. In 1941, the Viet Minh, a nationalist liberation movement based on a communist ideology, emerged under the Vietnamese revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh. The Viet Minh sought independence for Vietnam from France and the end of the Japanese occupation. After the military defeat of Japan in World War II and the fall of its puppet government Empire of Vietnam in August 1945, Saigon's administrative services collapsed and chaos, riots, and murder were widespread. The Viet Minh occupied Hanoi and proclaimed a provisional government, which asserted national independence on September 2. In July 1945, the Allies had decided to divide Indochina at the 16th parallel to allow Chiang Kai-shek of the Republic of China to receive the Japanese surrender in the north while Britain's Lord Louis Mountbatten received their surrender in the south. The Allies agreed that Indochina still belonged to France. But as the French were weakened by the German occupation, British Indian forces and the remaining Japanese Southern Expeditionary Army Group were used to maintain order and help France re-establish control through the 1945–1946 war in Vietnam. Ho initially chose to take a moderate stance to avoid military conflict with France, asking the French to withdraw their colonial administrators and for French professors and engineers to help build a modern independent Vietnam. But the provisional government of the French Republic did not act on these requests, including the idea of independence, and dispatched the French Far East Expeditionary Corps to restore colonial rule. This resulted in the Viet Minh launching a guerrilla campaign against the French in late 1946. The resulting First Indochina War lasted until July 1954. The defeat of French colonialists and Vietnamese loyalists in the 1954 Battle of Dien Bien Phu allowed Ho to negotiate a ceasefire from a favorable position at the subsequent Geneva Conference. The colonial administration was thereby ended and French Indochina was dissolved under the Geneva Accords of July 21, 1954 into three countries: Vietnam, and the kingdoms of Cambodia and Laos. Vietnam was further divided into North and South administrative regions at the demilitarized zone, roughly along the 17th parallel north. A 300-day period of free movement was permitted, during which almost 1 million northerners, mainly Catholics, moved south, fearing persecution by the communists. This migration was in large part aided by the United States military through Operation Passage to Freedom. The partition of Vietnam by the Geneva Accords was not intended to be permanent, and stipulated that Vietnam would be reunited after the elections. But in 1955, the southern state of Vietnam's Prime Minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, toppled Bao Dai in a fraudulent referendum organized by his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, and proclaimed himself President of the Republic of Vietnam. This effectively replaced the internationally recognized state of Vietnam by the Republic of Vietnam in the south, supported by the United States, France, Laos, Republic of China and Thailand, and Ho's Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, supported by the Soviet Union, Sweden, Khmer Rouge, and the People's Republic of China. Vietnam War. From 1953 to 1956, the North Vietnamese government instituted agrarian reforms including rent reduction and land reform, which resulted in significant political repression. This included 13,500 to as many as 100,000 executions. In the south, Diem countered North Vietnamese subversion, including the assassination of over 450 South Vietnamese officials in 1956 by detaining tens of thousands of suspected communists in political re-education centers. This program incarcerated many non-communists, but was successful at curtailing communist activity in the country, if only for a time. The North Vietnamese government claimed that 2,148 people were killed in the process by November 1957. The pro-Hanoi Viet Cong began a guerrilla campaign in South Vietnam in the late 1950s to overthrow Diem's government. From 1960, the Soviet Union and North Vietnam signed treaties providing for further Soviet military support. In 1963, Buddhist discontent with Diem's Catholic regime erupted into mass demonstrations, leading to a violent government crackdown. This led to the collapse of Diem's relationship with the United States, and ultimately to a 1963 coup in which he and Nhu were assassinated. The Diem era was followed by more than a dozen successive military governments, before the pairing of Air Marshal Nguyen Caoky and General Nguyen Van Thieu took control in mid-1965. Thieu gradually outmaneuvered KY and cemented his grip on power in fraudulent elections in 1967 and 1971. During this political instability, the Communists began to gain ground. To support South Vietnam's struggle against the Communist insurgency, the United States used the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident as a pretext for increasing its contribution of military advisors. U.S. forces became involved in ground combat operations by 1965, and at their peak several years later, numbered more than 500,000. The U.S. also engaged in sustained aerial bombing. Meanwhile, China and the Soviet Union provided North Vietnam with significant material aid and 15,000 combat advisors. Communist forces supplying the Viet Cong carried supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which passed through Laos. The Communists attacked South Vietnamese targets during the 1968 Tet Offensive. The campaign failed militarily, but shocked the American establishment and turned U.S. public opinion against the war. During the offensive, Communist troops massacred over 3,000 civilians at Hue. Facing an increasing casualty count, rising domestic opposition to the war, and growing international condemnation, the U.S. began withdrawing from ground combat roles in the early 1970s. This also entailed an unsuccessful effort to strengthen and stabilize South Vietnam. Following the Paris Peace Accords of January 27, 1973, all American combat troops were withdrawn by March 29, 1973. In December 1974, North Vietnam captured the province of Phuc Long and started a full-scale offensive, culminating in the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975. South Vietnam was ruled by a provisional government for almost 8 years while under North Vietnamese military occupation. Reunification and reforms. On July 2, 1976, North and South Vietnam were merged to form the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The war had devastated Vietnam and killed 966,000 to 3.8 million people. A 1974 U.S. Senate subcommittee estimated nearly 1.4 million Vietnamese civilians were killed or wounded between 1965 and 1974, including 415,000 killed. In its aftermath, under Le Duan's administration, there were no mass executions of South Vietnamese who had collaborated with the U.S. or the defunct South Vietnamese government, confounding Western fears, but up to 300,000 South Vietnamese were sent to re-education camps, where many endured torture, starvation, and disease while being forced to perform hard labor. The government embarked on a mass campaign of collectivization of farms and factories. Many fled the country following the conclusion of the war. In 1978, in response to the Khmer Rouge government of Cambodia ordering massacres of Vietnamese residents in the border villages in the districts of An Giang and Kien Giang, the Vietnamese military invaded Cambodia and removed them from power after occupying Phnom Penh. The intervention was a success, resulting in the establishment of a new, pro-Vietnam socialist government, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, which ruled until 1989. However, this worsened relations with China, which had supported the Khmer Rouge. China later launched a brief incursion into northern Vietnam in 1979, causing Vietnam to rely even more heavily on Soviet economic and military aid, while mistrust of the Chinese government escalated. At the 6th National Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam in December 1986, reformist politicians replaced the old guard government with new leadership. The reformers were led by 71-year-old Nguyen Van Linh, who became the party's new general secretary. He and the reformers implemented a series of free market reforms known as Doi Moi that carefully managed the transition from a planned economy to a socialist-oriented market economy. Although the authority of the state remained unchallenged under Doi Moi, the government encouraged private ownership of farms and factories, economic deregulation, and foreign investment, while maintaining control over strategic industries. Subsequently, Vietnam's economy achieved strong growth in agricultural and industrial production, construction, exports, and foreign investment, although these reforms also resulted in a rise in income inequality and gender disparities. In 2021, General Secretary of the Communist Party, Nguyen Phu Trong, was re-elected for his third term in office, meaning he is Vietnam's most powerful leader in decades. Government and politics. Vietnam is a unitary Marxist-Leninist one-party socialist republic, one of the two communist states in Southeast Asia. Although Vietnam remains officially committed to socialism as its defining creed, its economic policies have grown increasingly capitalist, with The Economist characterizing its leadership as ardently capitalist communists. Under the Constitution, the Communist Party of Vietnam asserts their role in all branches of the country's politics and society. The president is the elected head of state and the commander-in-chief of the military, serving as the chairman of the Council of Supreme Defense and Security, and holds the second highest office in Vietnam as well as performing executive functions and state appointments and setting policy. The General Secretary of the CPV performs numerous key administrative functions, controlling the party's national organization. The Prime Minister is the head of government, presiding over a council of ministers composed of 5 deputy prime ministers and the heads of 26 ministries and commissions. Only political organizations affiliated with or endorsed by the CPV are permitted to contest elections in Vietnam. These include the Vietnamese Fatherland Front and Worker and Trade Unionist parties. The National Assembly of Vietnam is the unicameral state legislature composed of 500 members. Headed by a chairman, it is superior to both the executive and judicial branches, with all government ministers being appointed from members of the National Assembly. The Supreme People's Court of Vietnam, headed by a Chief Justice, is the country's highest court of appeal, though it is also answerable to the National Assembly. Beneath the Supreme People's Court stand the provincial municipal courts and many local courts. Military courts possess special jurisdiction in matters of state security. Vietnam maintains the death penalty for numerous offenses. In 2023, a 3-person collective leadership was responsible for governing Vietnam. President Vo Van Thuong, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh since 2021 and the most powerful leader Nguyen Phu Trong since 2011 as the Communist Party of Vietnam's General Secretary. On May 22, 2024, Tu Lam, who previously served as the Minister of Public Security, was voted as the President of Vietnam by the National Assembly after Vo Van Thuong resigned on the same year due to corruption charges against him. On August 3, 2024, Tu Lam, who is also serving as the President, was elected by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Vietnam as the General Secretary following the death of Nguyen Phu Trong on July 19, 2024. Foreign relations. Throughout its history, Vietnam's main foreign relationship has been with various Chinese dynasties. Following the partition of Vietnam in 1954, North Vietnam maintained relations with the Eastern Bloc, South Vietnam maintained relations with the Western Bloc. Despite these differences, Vietnam's sovereign principles and insistence on cultural independence have been laid down in numerous documents over the centuries before its independence. These include the 11th century patriotic poem Nam Quoc Sun Ha and the 1428 Proclamation of Independence Ben Ngo Dai Cao. Though China and Vietnam are now formally at peace, significant territorial tensions remain between the two countries over the South China Sea. Vietnam holds membership in 63 international organizations, including the United Nations, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Non-Aligned Movement, International Organization of the Francophonie, and World Trade Organization. It also maintains relations with over 650 non-governmental organizations. As of 2010, Vietnam had established diplomatic relations with 178 countries. Vietnam's current foreign policy is to consistently implement a policy of independence, self-reliance, peace, cooperation, and development, as well openness, diversification, multilateralization with international relations. The country declares itself a friend and partner of all countries in the international community, regardless of their political affiliation, by actively taking part in international and regional cooperative development projects. Since the 1990s, Vietnam has taken several key steps to restore diplomatic ties with capitalist Western countries. It already had relations with communist Western countries in the decades prior. Relations with the United States began improving in August 1995 with both states upgrading their liaison offices to embassy status. As diplomatic ties between the two governments grew, the United States opened a consulate general in Ho Chi Minh City while Vietnam opened its consulate in San Francisco. Full diplomatic relations were also restored with New Zealand, which opened its embassy in Hanoi in 1995. Vietnam established an embassy in Wellington in 2003. President of the United States, Bill Clinton, made a historic visit to Vietnam in November 2000. He was the first U.S. leader ever to officially visit Hanoi and the first to visit Vietnam since U.S. troops withdrew from the country in 1975. Pakistan also reopened its embassy in Hanoi in October 2000, with Vietnam reopening its embassy in Islamabad in December 2005 and trade office in Karachi in November 2005. In May 2016, U.S. President Barack Obama further normalized relations with Vietnam after he announced the lifting of an arms embargo on sales of lethal arms to Vietnam. Despite their historical past, today Vietnam is considered to be a potential ally of the United States, especially in the geopolitical context of the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and in containment of Chinese expansionism. Economy. Throughout the history of Vietnam, its economy has been based largely on agriculture, primarily wet rice cultivation. Bauxite, an important material in the production of aluminum, is mined in central Vietnam. Since reunification, the country's economy is shaped primarily by the CPV through 5-year plans decided upon at the plenary sessions of the Central Committee and National Congresses. The collectivization of farms, factories, and capital goods was carried out as part of the establishment of central planning, with millions of people working for state enterprises. Under strict state control, Vietnam's economy continued to be plagued by inefficiency, corruption in state-owned enterprises, poor quality, and underproduction. With the decline in economic aid from its main trading partner, the Soviet Union, following the erosion of the Eastern Bloc in the late 1980s, and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as the negative impacts of the post-war trade embargo imposed by the United States, Vietnam began to liberalize its trade by devaluing its exchange rate to increase exports and embarked on a policy of economic development. In 1986, the Sixth National Congress of the CPV introduced socialist-oriented market economic reforms as part of the Doi Moi reform program. Private ownership began to be encouraged in industry, commerce, and agriculture, and state enterprises were restructured to operate under market constraints. This led to the 5-year economic plans being replaced by the socialist-oriented market mechanism. As a result of these reforms, Vietnam achieved approximately 8% annual gross domestic product growth between 1990 and 1997. The United States ended its economic embargo against Vietnam in early 1994. Although the 1997 Asian financial crisis caused an economic slowdown to 4 to 5% growth per year, its economy began to recover in 1999, and grew at around 7% per year from 2000 to 2005, one of the fastest in the world. On January 11, 2007, Vietnam became the 150th member of the WTO. According to the General Statistics Office of Vietnam, growth remained strong despite the late 2000s global recession, holding at 7% in 2010. Vietnam's year-on-year inflation rate reached 12% in December 2010, and the currency, the Vietnamese dong, was devalued 3 times. Deep poverty, defined as the percentage of the population living on less than 1 per day, has declined significantly in Vietnam, and the relative poverty rate is now less than that of China, India, and the Philippines. This decline can be attributed to equitable economic policies aimed at improving living standards and preventing the rise of inequality. These policies have included egalitarian land distribution during the initial stages of the Doi Moi program, investment in poorer remote areas, and subsidizing of education and health care. Since the early 2000s, Vietnam has applied sequenced trade liberalization, a 2-track approach opening some sectors of the economy to international markets. Manufacturing, information technology, and high-tech industries now form a large and fast-growing part of the national economy. Although Vietnam is a relative newcomer to the oil industry, it is the 3rd largest oil producer in Southeast Asia with a total 2011 output of 318,000 barrels per day. In 2010, Vietnam was ranked as the 8th largest crude petroleum producer in the Asia and Pacific region. The U.S. bought the biggest share of Vietnam's exports, while goods from China were the most popular Vietnamese import. Based on findings by the International Monetary Fund in 2022, the unemployment rate in Vietnam was 3%, the nominal GDP US $406.452 billion, and a nominal GDP per capita 4,000. Besides the primary sector economy, tourism has contributed significantly to Vietnam's economic growth, with 7.94 million foreign visitors recorded in 2015. Urbanization. The number of people who live in urbanized areas in 2019 is 33,122,548 people, with the urbanization rate at 34%. Since 1986, Vietnam's urbanization rates have surged rapidly after the Vietnamese government implemented the Doi Moi economic program, changing the system into a socialist one and liberalizing property rights. As a result, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City increased their share of the total urban population from 8.5% and 25% to 16% and 31% respectively. The Vietnamese government, through its construction ministry, forecasts the country will have a 45% urbanization rate by 2020, although it was confirmed to only be 34.4% according to the 2019 census. Urbanization is said to have a positive correlation with economic growth. Any country with higher urbanization rates has a higher GDP growth rate. Furthermore, the urbanization movement in Vietnam is mainly between the rural areas and the country's southeast region. Ho Chi Minh City has received a large number of migrants due mainly to better weather and economic opportunities. A study also shows that rural to urban area migrants have a higher standard of living than both non-migrants in rural areas and non-migrants in urban areas. This results in changes to economic structures. In 1985, agriculture made up 37% of Vietnam's GDP. In 2008, that number had declined to 18.5%. In 1985, industry made up only 26% of Vietnam's GDP. By 2008, that number had increased to 43%. Urbanization also helps to improve basic services which increase people's standards of living. Access to electricity grew from 14% of total households with electricity in 1993 to above 96% in 2009. In terms of access to fresh water, data from 65 utility companies shows that only 12% of households in the area covered by them had access to the water network in 2002. By 2007, more than 70% of the population was connected. Though urbanization has many benefits, it has some drawbacks since it creates more traffic and air and water pollution. Many Vietnamese use mopeds for transportation, since they are relatively cheap and easy to operate. Their large numbers have been known to cause traffic congestion and air pollution in Vietnam. In the capital city alone, the number of mopeds increased from 0.5 million in 2001 to 4.7 million in 2013. With rapid development, factories have sprung up which indirectly pollute the air and water, for example in the 2016 Vietnam marine life disaster. The government is intervening and attempting solutions to decrease air pollution by decreasing the number of motorcycles while increasing public transportation. It has introduced more regulations for waste handling. The amount of solid waste generated in urban areas of Vietnam has increased by more than 200% from 2003 to 2008. Industrial solid waste accounted for 181% of that increase. One of the government's efforts includes attempting to promote campaigns that encourage locals to sort household waste, since waste sorting is still not practiced by most of Vietnamese society. Languages. The national language of the country is Vietnamese, a tonal Austroasiatic language, which is spoken by the majority of the population. Vietnam's minority groups speak a variety of languages, including Tay, Muong, Cham, Khmer, Chinese, Nung, and Hmong. The Montagnard peoples of the Central Highlands also speak a number of distinct languages, some belonging to the Austroasiatic and others to the Malayo-Polynesian language families. In recent years, a number of sign languages have developed in the major cities. The French language, a legacy of colonial rule, is spoken by many educated Vietnamese as a second language, especially among those educated in the former South Vietnam, where it was a principal language in administration, education, and commerce. Vietnam remains a full member of the International Organization of the Francophonie, and education has revived some interest in the language. Russian, and to a lesser extent German, Czech, and Polish are known among some northern Vietnamese whose families had ties with the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. With improved relations with Western countries and recent reforms in Vietnamese administration, English has been increasingly used as a second language, and the study of English is now obligatory in most schools, either alongside or in place of French. The popularity of Japanese, Korean, and Mandarin Chinese have also grown as the country's ties with other East Asian nations have strengthened. Third graders can choose one of 7 languages of English, Russian, French, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, German as their first foreign language. In Vietnam's high school graduation examinations, students can take their foreign language exam in one of the above-mentioned languages. Religion. All citizens enjoy freedom of belief and religion. All religions are equal before the law, and each place of worship is protected under Vietnamese state law. Religious beliefs cannot be misused to undermine state law and policies. According to a 2007 survey, 81% of Vietnamese people did not believe in a god. Based on government findings in 2009, the number of religious people increased by 932,000. The official statistics, presented by the Vietnamese government to the United Nations Special Rapporteur in 2014, indicate the overall number of followers of recognized religions is about 24 million of a total population of almost 90 million. According to the General Statistics Office of Vietnam in 2019, Buddhists account for 5% of the total population, Catholics 6%, Protestants 1%, Ho-How Buddhists 1%, and Cabudaism followers 0.5%. Other religions includes Islam, Baha'is, and Hinduism, representing less than 0.5% of the population. The majority of Vietnamese do not follow any organized religion, though many of them observe some form of Vietnamese folk religion. Confucianism as a system of social and ethical philosophy still has certain influences in modern Vietnam. Mahayana is the dominant branch of Buddhism, while Theravada is practiced mostly by the Khmer minority. About 8 to 9% of the population is Christian, made up of Roman Catholics and Protestants. Catholicism was introduced to Vietnam in the 16th century and was firmly established by Jesuits missionaries, mainly Portuguese and Italian, in the 17th centuries from nearby Portuguese Macau. French missionaries from the Paris Foreign Missions Society together with Spanish missionaries from the Dominican Order of the neighboring Spanish East Indies actively sought converts in the 18th, 19th, and first half of the 20th century. A significant number of Vietnamese people, especially in the south, are also adherents of 2 indigenous religions of syncretic Cabudaism and quasi-Buddhist Ho-Hoism. Protestantism was only recently spread by American and Canadian missionaries in the 20th century. The largest Protestant denomination is the Evangelical Church of Vietnam. Around 770,000 of the country's Protestants are members of ethnic minorities, particularly the Highland Montagnard and Hmong people. Although it is one of the country's minority religions, Protestantism is the fastest growing religion in Vietnam, expanding at a rate of 600% in recent decades. Several other minority faiths exist in Vietnam. These include Bani, Sunni, and non-denominational sections of Islam, which is practiced primarily among the ethnic Cham minority. There are also a few kin adherents of Islam, other minority adherents of Baha'i, as well as Hindus among the Chams. Culture. Vietnamese culture is considered part of Sinosphere. Vietnam's culture has developed over the centuries from indigenous ancient Dong Son culture with wet rice cultivation as its economic base. Some elements of the nation's culture have Chinese origins, drawing on elements of Confucianism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Taoism in its traditional political system and philosophy. Vietnamese society is structured around Lang. All Vietnamese mark a common ancestral anniversary on the 10th day of the 3rd lunar month. The influence of Chinese culture such as the Cantonese, Hakka, Hokkien, and Hainanese cultures is more evident in the north where Buddhism is strongly entwined with popular culture. Despite this, there are Chinatowns in the south, such as in Cholan, where many Chinese have intermarried with kin and are indistinguishable among them. In the central and southern parts of Vietnam, traces of Kampa and Khmer culture are evidenced through the remains of ruins, artifacts as well within their population as the successor of the ancient Sa Win culture. In recent centuries, Western cultures have become popular among recent generations of Vietnamese. The traditional focuses of Vietnamese culture are based on humanity and harmony in which family and community values are highly regarded. Vietnam reveres a number of key cultural symbols, such as the Vietnamese dragon which is derived from crocodile and snake imagery. Vietnam's national father, Lac Long Quan, is depicted as a holy dragon. The lac is a holy bird representing Vietnam's national mother Oco. Other prominent images that are also revered are the turtle, buffalo, and horse. Many Vietnamese also believe in the supernatural and spiritualism where illness can be brought on by a curse or sorcery or caused by non-observance of a religious ethic. Traditional medical practitioners, amulets, and other forms of spiritual protection and religious practices may be employed to treat the ill person. In the modern era, the cultural life of Vietnam has been deeply influenced by government-controlled media and cultural programs. For many decades, foreign cultural influences, especially those of Western origin, were shunned. But since the recent Reformation, Vietnam has seen a greater exposure to neighboring Southeast Asian, East Asian as well to Western culture and media. The main Vietnamese formal dress, the Ao Dai, is worn for special occasions such as weddings and religious festivals. White Ao Dai is the required uniform for girls in many high schools across the country. Other examples of traditional Vietnamese clothing include, the Ao Tu Then, a four-piece woman's dress, the Ao Ngu, a form of the then in five-piece form, mostly worn in the north of the country, the Yem, a woman's undergarment, the Ao Baba, rural working pajamas for men and women, the Ao Gam, a formal brocade tunic for government receptions, and the Ao The, a variant of the Ao Gam worn by grooms at weddings. Traditional headwear includes the standard conical non la, the lampshade-like non K Thao, and the traditional turban, Con Van. In tourism, a number of popular cultural tourist destinations include the former imperial city of Hue, the World Heritage Sites of Phong Nha Bang National Park, Hoi An and Mai Son, coastal regions such as Nha Trang, the caves of Ha Long Bay and the Marble Mountains. Cuisine. Traditionally, Vietnamese cuisine is based around 5 fundamental taste elements: spicy, sour, salty, bitter, and sweet. Common ingredients include fish sauce, shrimp paste, soy sauce, rice, fresh herbs, fruits, and vegetables. Vietnamese recipes use lemongrass, ginger, mint, Vietnamese mint, long coriander, Saigon cinnamon, bird's eye chili, lime and basil leaves. Traditional Vietnamese cooking is known for its fresh ingredients, minimal use of oil and reliance on herbs and vegetables. It is considered one of the healthiest cuisines worldwide. The use of meats such as pork, beef, and chicken was relatively limited in the past. Instead, freshwater fish, crustaceans particularly crabs, and mollusks became widely used. Fish sauce, soy sauce, prawn sauce, and limes are among the main flavoring ingredients. Vietnam has a strong street food culture, with 40 popular dishes commonly found throughout the country. Many notable Vietnamese dishes such as salad roll, rice noodle roll, rice vermicelli soup and pho noodles originated in the north and were introduced to central and southern Vietnam by northern migrants. Local foods in the north are often less spicy than southern dishes, as the colder northern climate limits the production and availability of spices. Black pepper is frequently used in place of chilies to produce spicy flavors. Vietnamese drinks in the south also are usually served cold with ice cubes, especially during the annual hot seasons. In contrast, in the north hot drinks are more preferable in a colder climate. Some examples of basic Vietnamese drinks include Vietnamese iced coffee, egg coffee, salted pickled lime juice, glutinous rice wine, sugarcane juice, and Vietnamese lotus tea. Holidays and festivals. The country has 11 national recognized holidays. These include, New Year's Day on January 1st, Vietnamese New Year from the last day of the last lunar month to 5th day of the first lunar month, Hung King's Festival on the 10th day of the third lunar month, Reunification Day on April 30th, International Workers' Day on May 1st, and National Day on September 2nd. During Tet, many Vietnamese from the major cities will return to their villages for family reunions and to pray for dead ancestors. Older people will usually give the young a red envelope, while special holiday food, such as rice cake in a square shape together with variety of dried fruits, are presented in the house for visitors. Many other festivals are celebrated throughout the seasons, including the Tet Nguyen Tu, Tet Chung Thursday, and various temple and nature festivals. In the highlands, elephant race festivals are held annually during the spring. Riders will ride their elephants for about 1.6 kilometers and the winning elephant will be given sugar cane.